Thank you so much for coming tonight. And thank you to Kristen and the Center for Fiction. It's really fun to be here. I have been long admiring the events for the Center for Fiction, so it's great to be here, and this is such a lovely space, which is important to someone who cares about sense of place, which is the organizing principle of the Common. So the Common is a new-ish literary magazine. What we have on the back is issue number 4. And I wanted to create a magazine that published literature and images that had a strong sense of place. And because I felt like sense of place was sort of an archaic term, something that needed to be revivified. And we live in such mobile communities, mobile world, and to bring a focus back to how place is relevant in our lives, even though we all do move around so much and use digital technologies, seemed to be something that we could all think about through the lens of literature and art as well. So that's the mission of the Common. We publish 2 print issues per year. And have an online presence as well, which we publish original work, mostly essays and images 5 days a week. We're based at Amherst College, although we have many editorial staff in New York, including Sonya. And so a large part of the heart of the Common is in New York, so it's great to be here. I'm not really going to introduce the authors since you do all have bios. I just want to say how lovely it is to be here with Hari and Jennifer and Sonya. And so I think you'd probably rather hear what they have to say about their work. You can read about them on your own. So I'm going to start just to my left and ask Hari to go first. So I want to ask him about Gods Without Men, your recent novel, which is fascinating in many ways, but there is one central place, the place called the Pinnacles, this rock formation in the Mojave Desert, which is the place where all of these storylines from multiple centuries intersect. So of course I want to know what captured your imagination about this place and how you got to be writing this multi-narrative book that revolves around a particular geographic spot.
Hi everyone. Well, it was a novel that did come out of place first, and the stories in the book kind of emerged from a response to the place, and I actually first went to the Mojave in the week after 9/11, which was where I was stranded in LA. I was living in London, and the attacks happened, and there were, they closed the airspace and all the rest of it, and I was having a kind of increasingly weird time, just sort of kicking my heels in West Hollywood, and wanted to be on my own, and ended up driving out into the desert, which seemed like quite a good place to be at that point. And maybe it was that context, but I was incredibly struck by that landscape. And then much later, when I moved to the States in 2008, I was at the New York Public Library. I was supposed to be there writing a novel about 16th century India, which was failing to happen. It was all kind of falling apart in my hands, really. And some friends said, look, if you're doing nothing better, you should come with us on a road trip out to Joshua Tree, and I did, and I kind of never came back. And so, I mean, as you know, the Mojave is a high desert. It's a kind of white landscape. It's a place where there seems to be a kind of abolition of the boundary between earth and sky sometimes, especially in the height of summer, when the sun is incredibly bright and kind of falling on this kind of sometimes sort of bone white dust. The glare is so intense that it kind of bleaches everything out, and I had a really visceral sense that this was, I really understood why since the beginning of time, people have gone out into the desert to kind of confront some metaphysical absolute. And of course, the Mojave in particular is a desert which also has a history of use as military land, and there's a secret state is very present in the desert landscape there. There are endless places that you can't go. There are occulted things and hidden things about this place that is paradoxically so bright, and so kind of so there's this interesting kind of duality immediately between things that are hidden and things that can't be seen, and this kind of excess of light. So, you know, I got very interested in the idea of dazzle and glare, and all these kind of things started to inform the sort of stories that I wanted to tell about that place.
And did you know much about the history of this place when you first started thinking about it being the centerpiece of a novel? I ended up knowing a great deal more. One of the things that happened on this road trip was that we went to a place called the Integratron, which is in a place called Landers, California, and a guy called George Van Tassel in the late 1940s took his family out of LA. He was an aircraft engineer in Burbank, and he took his wife and I think 2 kids to live under what's supposed to be the world's largest freestanding boulder, which is meant to be called Giant Rock. In this place, Landers, and there was a room dug out there by an old miner who previously lived there, and he moved in there, and then one night in 1947 he was sleeping outside and had a visitation from Venus, and they gave him, the Venusians were very pleasant to him, they gave him the secret of life extension. They were here to, they were very worried about the Cold War. They felt that humanity was about to blow itself up, and the only thing that would help us would be to live for longer. And so they gave George the secret of life extension, and then he devoted the next 20 years to trying to raise money to build this life extension machine, which was going to do some cell repair. It was basically a giant electromagnetic coil in a building with 2 floors that looks like a wooden observatory, a domed building, and there'd be a potential between upstairs and downstairs, and you would walk around in a quite hieratic fashion, I think, downstairs in robes, and your cells would be rejuvenated and you'd live forever and not kill the world with nuclear war. So can we find that machine?
It is there, but of course George was about to switch it on when he died of a heart attack. In a novelistic irony that was too cheesy to use. And there's a whole conspiracy thing about Men in Black turning up to taking his electronics and his plans, which were at least partly based on the dimensions of the Great Pyramid at Giza, and hence definitely going to work. But anyway, the building is there. It's owned by 3 sisters from LA who run it as a meditation retreat. So you can go and get a sound bath. Somebody will play crystal Tibetan bowls that play this very pure tone in this extraordinary. It's actually acoustically perfect. This dome, sort of by accident, almost. It's an incredible place.
How much time have you spent in this dome?
I've only visited twice. So I spent a couple of days like in the dome, and then a lot more days like hanging around in the other places.
Right. So there was a combination of visitation, investigating on the spot, and a fair amount of library research as well.
Yeah.
There's 17th century
Yeah,
tales and mythology woven into this.
Yeah, I took a lot of road trips, and basically it was an excuse to spend a lot of time out there in different ways, either kind of directed trips or just really wandering around. Then kind of digging through secondhand bookshops, finding kind of old histories of the desert and so on and so forth. And it was one of those projects where one thing seemed very naturally to lead to another, and I was worried at certain points that I sort of shouldn't put all this into the same thing, but it seemed that was the right way to go.
Mm-hmm. Well, the desert is a fascinating place, and so far from where we are here. And Jennifer, your story that's in this issue of The Common is also in a desert landscape of a historical time, although not so far in the past as some of the strands in Hari's novel. So I wonder if you could also talk about the setting of A Place in the Sun, sort of the 1960s Las Vegas, was it the idea of this particular kind of gambler that first interested you, or was there something about the way the city grew up in the desert that made you want to write about it?
Well, you know, it is very much a story about place, but it did not begin with the place. This story, A Place in the Sun, is part of a collection of stories that I have coming up next month called News from Heaven. And these are 10 stories that are united by place. Most of them take place in the same location. It's a town in western Pennsylvania where my second novel, Baker Towers, was set. So it's a fictional landscape that is very familiar to me. 8 of the 10 stories take place in that town. That's really, it's almost like the Winesburg, Ohio way of organizing a story collection. That really is the spine of it. This story, A Place in the Sun, is unlike the others in that it actually does happen somewhere else. The main character in this story, Sandy Novak, is sort of a refugee from this town in Pennsylvania. And in the story, he is on a desperate gambling trip in Las Vegas. He lives in LA, drives to Las Vegas because he really, really needs to win some money. I'm completely fascinated by Las Vegas, which I think is the most terrible place on earth. But that does not sort of dim my enthusiasm for writing about it. When I speak, well, in a certain way it does, that's right. It does. And you know, part of what I find seductive about Las Vegas is that, gosh, it is a city with no trace of the past. It's almost like walking on the beach, you know, at low tide, and your footprints are going to be gone in 12 hours. And, you know, that's how Las Vegas feels to me, that the landscape I was writing about, excuse me, 1967, is completely gone. There's almost no trace of it to be found today. So it wasn't as though I could visit Las Vegas to do research for this story. It ain't there. You can't get there anymore. So the place I needed to get to, I sort of had to conjure in my mind. I couldn't go and see it. You know, it's been raised and paved over, you know, 6 or 7 times since then. It's completely gone. So for me, it was sort of fascinating to try to reconstruct what that city was at that particular moment. And actually, I went so far as to draw myself a map, street by street, of this is the Strip, this is Fremont Street, this is downtown, this is which hotel was on which corner, across from which hotel, which casino, which restaurant, which bar. And that whole kind of loving process of reconstructing that place that is gone was where I found the story. I was looking at a lot of magazines from that period. A great deal has been written about Las Vegas, and but particularly at that time. That was sort of its, you know, the height of America's fascination with this place. And you know, it really is kind of like, it's an amusement park for big, slow children with money. And it was then. It's you know,
Why
it's
slow? Don't you have to move fast?
No, you really don't.
No?
And in fact, I mean,
I've seen how people kind of go with those enormous blue drinks and they're like, so they're walking through treacle. It's bizarre.
I see. But don't you have to make fast decisions? Or I guess they count on you not doing that, and that's
part of the Las Vegas experience too. So this is a story about place that grew out of my fascination with this place, but is also connected to this larger work that is itself about place. You know, the stories in News from Heaven could not have taken place anywhere else. That town, it's a little, it's sort of a dead coal mining town in western Pennsylvania. If you know my second novel, Baker Towers, then you've already been there. But this collection of stories sort of follows it over time. So you see this town in its heyday between the 2 world wars, and you see it fall on hard times. And A Place in the Sun is the 5th story in the collection, so it's in the dead center before the town has collapsed completely. But Sandy Novak is one of those people who has, you know, escaped the sinking ship.
As you were writing this collection with so many of the pieces set in the same place. Did writing A Place in the Sun feel a little bit like an escape for you? Like you could get out of this one town that you were writing about and imagine somewhere else?
Yeah, I mean, just the weather was better, you know. Yeah, it really, I took a lot of joy in writing this story, and part of it was, you know, as a writer, I was starting to feel as trapped and oppressed by this little coal mining town as my characters themselves were feeling. So I was a little bit like Sandy. I was a kind of a refugee from there.
You need to get out in the sun.
That's right.
And lose some money. Win some and lose some. So what you said about sort of drawing a map is something that I want to get back to and ask, you know, ask you all about your construction of places. But so I want to ask Sonya about the construction of the village in Long for This World. And so this is a village that's very traditional, and I wonder if you could sort of set up what kind of place this is. It's on a lake. There's one of the central families is the Han family, and they're wealthy and have built this interesting Western house. And so also the context of that Western house in this traditional village is an interesting thing to think about too. So can you tell us a little bit about the village and how you came to write about that place?
Sure. So this is a small town in southern South Korea that is, I mean, I guess it's funny, I wasn't that conscious about it, but it is very specifically placed. It's not exactly coastal, but it's close enough. So it's a town where you would drive a little bit and you'd be coastal. It's a town that kind of smells like fish. That was very clear to me. And it's actually, so it was inspired, that place was, the place in the novel was inspired by my first visit to Korea. So my parents are immigrants from Korea. They came when they were adults in the late 60s, and I was born here. And I didn't make my first visit to Korea until I was in my early 30s, which is a little unusual for someone of my generation. Most of my peers, they go when they're teenagers, and they go with their parents to meet some of their relatives. But I hadn't gone until I was really an adult. So it was, any of you had that experience of going sort of back to the place that you're from, but that is a totally foreign place to you. It's a very rich and fertile kind of experience. So it was actually sort of that perfect kind of inspiration for fiction, which is that I spent, it was part of a larger travel tour, so I spent, you know, nearly just 48 hours or so in that place. My father is one of 12 children, so there was just like a slew of relatives to be meeting, lots of food being thrown at me. Nobody spoke English. I speak, you know, elementary Korean. So it was a very impressionistic kind of visit, which was sort of perfect because it made these very sort of sensory impressions on me, but because, you know, it's where my parents are from, because it's sort of, you know, my homeland, there was also a lot of sort of emotional impressions.
Is that the only time you've been there, that one?
No, so after that visit, I returned to Korea 2 more times, but spent most of my time in Seoul and in those visits. So it's that kind of perfect sort of cross-section of real experience and imagination. So it became a place that I was able to really imagine, in addition to sort of using some actual sensory details. And the same with the people that I met. You know, I spent a day, maybe 36 hours with my aunt and uncle who were hosting us. And again, they didn't speak very much English, so it was just a lot of like smiling and nodding. But they made an impression on me, and so I was able to sort of imagine who they might be in these characters in the novel. So that's sort of, but it needed to be a place. So part of the story is that 2 characters who are related to these characters, but who've emigrated to the U.S. So they're American like me. They sort of flee their lives and go to this little village. So it had to be, and they're very urban people. One of them is a war photographer. They have very tense, stressful lives. So it needed to be a place where they could decompress. It needed to be a place where The roads were wide and open, and there weren't very many cars. It needed to be a place where there were mountains and lakes, and it needed to be that kind of place. So that's how sort of place and character were working.
Mm-hmm. And this house in the book, I'm interested in. So there's a sort of the most well-to-do family of the village, the Han family. And they make the decision when they have some money to construct a non-traditional house. It has Western features, but they also want to maintain some Eastern and Asian features, leave it a little bit more open. So could you talk about that? And it becomes very symbolic for the other characters in the book. Everyone asks about it, and the relatives come and they ask each other, "What do you think about this house?" Because it's so different from what's around them.
Yeah, it's this weird house. I hope when you read it, you're actually able to picture it, because it's this kind of traditional Korean village. So most of the homes are kind of more horizontal and they're vertical, right? So, but this house is 2 stories, and it's got kind of a Tudor exterior. So it's this weird house. And what I did was I actually used the exterior of the house was real. This is actually what my uncle's house looked like. But then I invented the interior of the house to do some different things with character and create a conversation about it. But that was also part of, so even though this family is very traditional, there was something about them. They were sort of the big fish in this small pond. So the husband is a physician, and he's all about Western medicine. I mean, he's sort of this paradox. He's all about Western medicine, but for himself, he uses hanyak, which is the traditional kind of healing stuff. Because it needed to be a place where Eastern and Western could collide. It needed to be a place where all the characters, especially the characters coming from the U.S. to the town, could feel somehow like some connection, but they also needed to feel uncomfortable in the place. So the family there, being the big fish in the small pond, means that they have connections to the West. It means that some of their clients bring them Starbucks coffee from Seoul, and their son sends them Adidas slippers, and there are these little ways in which Western culture kind of comes in. So this house is sort of another example of that. Now the interior of the house, which I invented, it's described as having sort of open beams and kind of unfinished, and it ends up becoming, I mean, one of the conversations that happens around the house is actually among the women. So the women, the mother figure and her daughters-in-law are in the kitchen doing their women things. And one of the daughters-in-law asks the mother-in-law about the house and starts to talk about it. And one of the daughters-in-law, who's very, in Korean we say chakesh, is very like a good daughter-in-law, but she's also, it's sort of part of this westernizing, modernizing. She's also been to college, she studied architecture, she knows something about this. So she starts to ask her mother-in-law about it. And the young women have a conversation about the architecture. And then the mother, who is this very traditional but very strong figure, her comment comes back sort of passive-aggressive but sort of powerful, like, "Oh, you young women, you know so much about so many things these days. You know, in my day, we really didn't know about things like architecture." So the conversation around the house becomes a way for the women in the book to kind of position themselves around modernity and sort of intellectual development. So for me, I think place and character. Sort of how can I get the most out of the place? How can the characters kind of work off the place?
And so I'm thinking just a little bit about process. Like you had a very clear picture of what the interior and exterior of this house looks like, and maybe you had photographs, or maybe you're just sort of reconstructed in your mind. And Jennifer, you were talking about making maps, and so is this a normal part of your creative processes to make these kinds of maps? And for all of you, is there some sort of physical pen on paper, posting photographs in your room? How do you remind yourself of what the space is like? Or you just keep it in your imagination?
Well, I take a lot of pictures, and often the most useful things to take pictures of aren't nicely framed kind of tourist views, but street furniture and kind of sort of odd bits of specifics that you probably wouldn't quite be able to recall unless you had a visual image. I mean, when I've written stuff set in the past, I end up spending a lot of time researching, looking for photographs, because there are kind of odd things about spaces and the ways, yeah, I mean, just the way people occupy street space are very different. I mean, I was just reading Real Life of Sebastian Knight, the Nabokov book, and there's a passage in there where he notes that he's seeing a historical view of St. Petersburg, and there's so little traffic, and it's not powered traffic, that there was no need for any kind of regulation of the streets. So in this view, you see all the carriages at crazy angles rather than lines of traffic, and that kind of detail is always seems to kind of bring stuff with it.
And so you mentioned the 16th century India, and I'm curious about, were there drawings of spaces that you were looking at, and when you were
that novel, which I am going to go back to, is set at the court of the Emperor Akbar, who at a certain point in his reign was desperate for an heir and was out hunting in a very arid plain near Agra in North India, and met a holy man, a Muslim peer, who said, if you build a city on the side of my heart here, I can guarantee you'll have a son. And you'll have a son, and thank me by building a city. So, and duly Akbar had a son, and then did build this extraordinary city, Fatehpur Sikri, on this spot, which had no decent water supply. And so they had to abandon the place in about 15 years, and it is this extraordinary kind of red sandstone citadel that is incredibly well preserved, and you get a sense of certainly the kind of centre of the city, which has all these kind of public spaces and kind of palaces and things, places for entertainment. It's a really, really unusual and particular kind of disposition of space. So I was very much thinking about that.
Right, so that's a place that you can visit, and to some extent, you transport yourself.
It's very straightforward,
a few centuries to sort of imagine what it might have been like to inhabit.
Well, the difficulty with that book, and the reason that I found it very hard to go on, was just it wasn't. The space is one thing, but it's kind of relations of power, and actually there's some very counterintuitive things about the Mughal court and just the way people held offices and the way people held land and the way people behaved towards one another. There is sort of their rituals, courtly rituals, which are not easy to reconstruct, and I was finding that quite daunting and kind of needing a route through it that I wasn't finding.
Right. So there was some piece of research that was sort of preventing place from becoming completely
not
alive.
Persian was kind of
that's overcomable, surely.
It's a slightly longer term project than I thought.
Right.